You didn't have much, but somehow, you had everything. There was a specific smell to a working-class home in the 1970s pot roast stretching itself across 3 dinners. Cigarette smoke curled into wallpaper that hadn't been changed since the Johnson administration. The faint chemical sweetness of a can of Tab soda cracked open on a Friday night like it was champagne. You wore hand-me-down Toughskins from Sears, and you didn't think twice about it. Because everyone on your block wore the same. Because everyone on your block was the same. And if any of that just hit you somewhere deep in your chest, welcome home. Welcome back to American Retold, the channel where we sit down together and remember the America that shaped us. I'm so glad you're here today. Because this one is personal. We're going back to the 1970s, a decade that doesn't get nearly enough credit for what it actually was for the millions of ordinary working-class families who lived it day to day. Not the disco, not Watergate, not the mood rings and the pet rocks, but the real 1970s, the one that smelled like motor oil and Hamburger Helper.
The one where your dad worked a plant shift and your mom stretched a $20 grocery run like a miracle worker. We're going to cover the signs, the memories, the little details that will tell you without a shadow of a doubt whether you grew up working class in that extraordinary, complicated, beautiful decade. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to American Retold.
We put out new videos every week, and every single one is made for people exactly like you, people who know that the best history was never written in a textbook. It was lived in a kitchen. Now, cast your mind back. To understand what working-class life felt like in the 1970s, you have to understand what America was going through. And let me tell you, America was going through it. The decade opened with the tail end of the Vietnam War dragging across the national conscience like a wound that wouldn't close. Richard Nixon was in the White House, and by 1974 he was gone, resigning in disgrace after Watergate shook the country's faith in its own institutions to the foundation. Gerald Ford stepped in, stumbled literally and figuratively. And then Jimmy Carter arrived in 1977, carrying the weight of a nation that felt lost. And through all of it, the politics, the protests, the cultural upheaval, ordinary working families just kept going. They had to. The economy in the early 70s was being strangled by something that economists had told us couldn't exist: stagflation. Inflation and unemployment at the same time. Prices were climbing while wages weren't. The 1973 oil crisis hit like a punch nobody saw coming. Gas lines stretched around city blocks. The price of a gallon of gasoline went from about 39 cents in 1973 to over 65 cents by 1974. And that doesn't sound like much until you understand what that meant for a family man driving a beat-up '68 Dodge to a factory shift every single morning. By 1979, gas had climbed past $1 a gallon, and people were furious. The minimum wage in 1970 was $1.60 an hour. By 1979, it had risen to $2.90, but inflation had eaten so much of that raise that families often felt no better off than they had a decade before. And yet there was something about those working-class neighborhoods of the 1970s that defied the economic misery on paper. Front stoops were occupied. Kids were everywhere. Church potlucks and Union Hall dances and 4th of July cookouts where the potato salad sat in the sun for 3 hours and nobody died. The television set in the corner showed you all in the family. And Archie Bunker was your dad, or your uncle, or your neighbor, and you laughed. Because it was true. And you winced. Because it was true. This was the America that built an entire generation of people who are tougher, more resourceful, and more grateful than they ever get credit for. And if you were there, you know exactly what I mean. The dinner table was a masterclass in making nothing into something. Cast your mind back to that kitchen table. Not a dining room. Working-class homes in the 70s didn't have dining rooms. There was a kitchen, and there was a table in it, and that table did everything. Homework was done there. Bills were sorted there and sometimes argued over there quietly, after the kids were supposed to be asleep. And every single night, your mother or your grandmother produced a meal out of what seemed like thin air. Hamburger Helper was not a shortcut in your house. It was a strategy. The green box with the little white glove appeared on the shelf like a savior, and you were genuinely excited to see it. Kraft macaroni and cheese, the one in the blue box, was practically a love language. A whole chicken on Sunday became sandwiches on Monday and soup by Wednesday. Nothing was wasted. Bread heels. Bacon grease saved in a coffee can by the stove. Leftover mashed potatoes fried up in a pan the next morning with a little butter and a pinch of salt and served like they were something special, and somehow they were. The smell of a pot of beans with ham hocks simmering since noon still hits differently than anything a Michelin-starred restaurant has ever put in front of you. A pound of ground beef could feed 5 people if you knew what you were doing. And the women in those working-class kitchens knew exactly what they were doing. They were geniuses. Every one of them. They just never got a trophy for it. Clothes were something you earned, not something you collected. There was no such thing as shopping for fun. Clothes shopping in a working-class family in the 1970s was a military operation, planned, budgeted, and conducted with the precision of a general. The Sears catalog was your Bible. You'd lay it open on the living room floor and circle things in pencil, knowing full well that you'd get maybe 2 items from that entire wish list. Toughskins jeans from Sears were reinforced at the knees because working-class kids played hard and pants couldn't afford to fall apart. If you wore out the knees anyway, and you always did, your mother ironed on an oval patch and you kept wearing them. Your school shoes were bought a full size too big at the start of the year. You'll grow into them, she said. And by spring you had. Hand-me-downs weren't embarrassing, they were just how clothes worked. Your older brother's jacket became yours, became your younger sister's. The only new clothes you truly looked forward to were the ones under the Christmas tree, carefully wrapped, usually practical, and received with a gratitude that kids raised differently simply cannot replicate. The JCPenney layaway counter was where your mother spent half of October putting things away a little at a time. She'd pay it off by December and you'd never know the difference. That is not poverty. That is love structured around a budget. And you were better dressed than you ever realized. The television was sacred and had 3 channels. There was one television in the house. One. It sat in the living room on a pressed wood stand, and if you were lucky, it had a remote control. Though in most working-class homes in the early 70s, the remote control was the youngest kid. Go turn it to channel 4. And you went. Saturday morning was the closest thing to a religious experience that secular American childhood ever produced. You were up before your parents. You were in front of that set by 7 in the morning in your pajamas with a bowl of Cap'n Crunch, watching Bugs Bunny and the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo like your life depended on it. Nobody talked on Saturday morning cartoons. That was the law. During the week, the whole family gathered for primetime. The Waltons on Thursday nights made your mom cry. Happy Days made everyone laugh. MASH made your dad go quiet in a way you didn't fully understand until you were much older. You watched what was on. There was no rewinding, no pausing, no watching it again on demand. If you missed an episode of The $6 Million Man, that episode was simply gone from your life. And maybe that's why it all meant so much. When there were only 3 channels and 4 hours of evening television, you paid attention. Every moment of it was something. The car was a member of the family. For better or worse, working-class families in the 1970s had a relationship with their cars that went far beyond transportation. The car was a source of pride and a source of constant grinding anxiety in equal measure. Your dad's car from the early 70s was likely an American-made Model A Ford Pinto, a Chevy Impala, a Dodge Dart, big, heavy, thirsty for gas, and held together by his own 2 hands and the grace of God. Saturday morning was not just cartoons. Saturday morning was also the sound of your father in the driveway, head under the hood, doing whatever needed doing because taking it to a mechanic cost money you didn't have. He changed his own oil. He replaced his own brake pads. He rebuilt carburetors on the kitchen table with newspaper spread underneath and parts laid out in precise order. And when the '73 oil crisis hit and gas lines stretched around the block, your family felt it in a way that was immediate and physical. Odd-even rationing meant you could only buy gas on certain days of the week depending on your license plate. Some stations ran out, some stations closed, and your father sat in that line without complaint, because complaining didn't fill the tank. But here's what you might not know: the 1970s oil crisis also quietly accelerated America's shift towards smaller, more fuel-efficient imports. Honda and Toyota were coming. Your dad may have hated that, but somewhere deep down he understood. The car was never just the car. It was the trip to work, the paycheck, the rent, the groceries. And keeping it running was a full-time second job. 5. Summer was unsupervised and absolutely magnificent. There was no camp. There was no structured enrichment. There was no parental itinerary for your summer in a working-class neighborhood in the 1970s. There was the street. And the street was everything. You left after breakfast and came home when the streetlights came on, and nobody panicked in between. You built things out of scrap wood behind someone's garage. You rode your bike, likely a Huffy or a Schwinn, until the wheels were nearly worn smooth. Performing stunts in empty parking lots like you were auditioning for something nobody had invented yet. You played pickup baseball in a field that wasn't technically anyone's field, but also wasn't technically not yours. You caught fireflies in mason jars. You drank from garden hoses. You found things, old coins in the gutter. A stray dog you tried to keep for 4 days before your mother found out. Trouble of various kinds, none of it serious, most of it memorable. The ice cream truck came around in the afternoons, and a creamsicle cost a dime if you had a dime. Sometimes you didn't, and you watched it go by with a face that belonged on a Depression-era photograph. But mostly you found the dime. Mostly you found a way. Because working-class kids in the 1970s were extraordinarily good at finding a way. The summer stretched out in front of you like it would last forever. And somehow, impossibly, it always did. 6. Doctor visits were a last resort, not a first response. You were not taken to the doctor every time something went wrong. You were taken to the doctor when something was clearly, undeniably, frighteningly wrong. A working-class family in the 1970s did not have generous health insurance, and many had none at all. The emergency room was not a place you went with a bad cough. The emergency room was a place you hoped you would never see the inside of, because the bill that followed was capable of destroying 3 months of careful budgeting in a single afternoon. So your mother had her arsenal. Vicks Vapo Rub went on everything: chest, back, the bottoms of your feet if she read something about it in a magazine. Mercurochrome for cuts, bright red, burning like fire, applied with the no-nonsense speed of a field surgeon. Chicken soup for illness, a heating pad for muscle pain, and the phrase "walk it off" for everything in between. Teeth were perhaps the most complicated territory of all. A toothache in a working-class family could go on for weeks before anyone admitted it had crossed the line into dental visit territory. And when you did finally go, you went to whoever was cheapest. School nurse visits were free, and those women saw everything. They were the quiet, unsung healthcare workers of a generation, checking eyes, checking ears, sending notes home about this or that, with a gentleness that somehow never made anything worse. Your health was looked after, just not by a system designed with your family in mind. It was looked after by your mother, by practical wisdom, by home remedies passed down 2 generations, and by sheer stubborn refusal to let anything beat you. 7. The neighborhood was your entire world, and that was enough. Cast your mind back to the street where you grew up. Every house on that street was part of your life in a way that simply doesn't exist anymore. You knew the names of every family. You knew who kept a neat garden and who let the weeds go. You knew whose mother made the best cookies and whose father had the loudest laugh. In working-class neighborhoods of the 1970s, proximity created community in a way that money couldn't manufacture. Doors were left unlocked because locking them felt like an insult to your neighbors. If you fell off your bike in front of Mrs. Kowalski's house, Mrs. Kowalski came out with a cloth and cleaned your knee before your own mother even knew it happened. Barbecues spread across 3 backyards. Arguments were loud and forgotten by Sunday. The corner store, a proper family-run corner store, not a chain, was where credit was extended on the basis of a handshake and a known surname. Put it on my tab was a functioning financial system. Your neighborhood was not just where you lived. It was your economy, your social life, your safety net, your entertainment, and your identity. You didn't vacation far. You might not vacation at all. But you belonged somewhere in a way that felt absolute. You were somebody's kid on that street. Everybody knew whose kid you were. And every single adult on that block felt some small responsibility for you, whether you wanted them to or not. That is something you cannot put a dollar value on. That is something the 1970s gave you that no decade since has managed to replicate. Before we go any further, let's take a moment for something a little different. Here are 3 things about working-class life in 1970s America that might genuinely surprise you. Did you know that in 1970, the United States had more union members than at any point in its history? Nearly 30% of all workers were unionized. That number has been falling ever since, sitting at around 10% today. For millions of working-class families, the union hall wasn't just a place your dad went to meetings at. It was the reason you had health coverage, a pension, and a paid vacation at all. Did you know that Kool-Aid was invented as a Depression-era alternative to expensive beverages, and by the 1970s had become so deeply embedded in working-class culture that the company was running some of the most successful advertising campaigns on American television? A packet cost a dime. It made a whole pitcher. That math mattered enormously. Did you know that the term working poor people who are employed but still living below the poverty line was formally studied and documented for the first time during the 1970s? Researchers found that millions of American families had at least one full-time worker and still couldn't reliably afford food, clothing, and shelter all at the same time. Not because they weren't working hard enough, but because the wages simply weren't there. That finding changed policy conversations, but it didn't change fast enough for the families living it. A gallon of milk in 1975 cost about $1.57. Today it runs between $4 and $5 depending on where you live. But here's the thing: in 1975, a factory worker earning the average manufacturing wage of around $4.80 an hour could buy 3 gallons of milk with 1 hour of work. Today, that same calculation, depending on where you work, may look better or worse, but the feeling of it is different, and that feeling matters. In 1970, a working-class family in a Midwestern city could buy a modest 3-bedroom home for around $23,000. Today, that same house in that same city is listed at $280,000. Wages have not kept pace. Not even close. Neighborhoods that were once tightly knit communities of working families have been transformed by forces that had nothing to do with the people who lived in them. The corner stores are gone. The union halls are mostly gone. The front stoops are sometimes gone too, replaced by garage doors that open directly into houses. Because we no longer need to sit outside and be part of something larger than ourselves. Or so we've been told. But here's what I will say: the values forged in those working-class homes of the 1970s didn't go anywhere. Resilience, resourcefulness, the stubborn, quiet dignity of people who never once asked for a trophy for simply getting on with it. That is still here. You are still here. And that is worth more than any house price or wage index has ever managed to calculate. Now I want to hear from you. Because the truth is, I can tell this story all day long, but the best version of it lives in your memory, not mine.
Every one of you watching this right now has a detail, a smell, a sound, a specific Saturday morning, a dinner your mother made, a summer afternoon that lasted forever that belongs uniquely to you. And I genuinely want to know what it is. So leave it in the comments below. Tell us everything.
And here's my specific question for you today. What is the one meal from your childhood that you could go back to right now, the one that appeared on that kitchen table regularly, made out of very little, that somehow tasted like everything good? Tell me the meal. Tell me who made it. Tell me what it meant to you. Because I promise you, someone else watching this video right now grew up eating the exact same thing. And that connection, that's what this channel is all about. Working class life in 1970s America was not glamorous. Nobody is going to make a prestige television series about the inside of a hamburger helper kitchen on a Tuesday night in 1976. Nobody is going to romanticize the gas lines or the tight shoes bought a size too big or the bills sorted quietly after the kids were in bed. But we are going to remember it. Because forgetting it would be a kind of betrayal of the people who raised us, of the neighborhoods that shaped us, of the version of America that never made the magazines but absolutely made the nation. The 1970s working class didn't have much. But they had pride, a genuine, unperformable pride that came from knowing they were holding everything together with their own 2 hands. They had community, the kind you build slowly, face to face, across a back fence over 20 years. They had ingenuity, because necessity is a ruthless teacher, and those families had PhDs in making it work. And they had each other, which, when you sit down and think about it honestly, turns out to be the only thing that ever actually mattered. If this video meant something to you, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find this channel, and every view brings us closer to the stories we want to tell.
Subscribe to American Retold if you haven't already. We are building something here together, and you belong in it. And in our next video, we're heading back even further to the 1950s, to the first generation of American suburbia, to the era of Eisenhower and tail fins, and a country that had just survived the unthinkable and was trying, with everything it had, to build something new.
You are not going to want to miss it. Until then, take care of each other. Those were the days, friend. Those were absolutely the days.